The following sermon is called The Hope of the Cast Down Soul. The preacher is J.C. Philpot, preached at Zoar Chapel, London on Thursday evening, July 17th, 1845. Why are you cast down, O my soul, and why are you disturbed in me? Hope in God. Psalm 42, verse 5. There is something singularly tender and touching in the inquiry that David here makes of his own soul. He addresses it as a faithful and tender companion of all his joys and all his sorrows, his treasure and his all. For if our soul be happy, we must needs be happy. If our soul be troubled, we must needs be troubled. If our soul be safe, we must needs be safe. If our soul be cast down, we must needs be cast down too. Not that there is any thought or feeling in man distinct from his soul. I mean not that. But David here addresses his soul as being that which is the most precious part of man, redeemed at an infinite price by the blood of the Lamb, and the prosperity or adversity of which must ever deeply interest him. In this touching and affectionate address to his soul, we may notice two things. Number one, the question itself, why are you cast down, O my soul? And why are you disturbed in me? Number two, the encouragement that he addresses to his cast down and disturbed soul, hope in God. First, the question itself. Why are you cast down, O my soul, and why are you disturbed in me? It is evident from the very form of the question that David here puts that his soul was cast down. If it were not cast down and disturbed in him, the inquiry that he makes as to the cause of its disquietude would be utterly useless. But we may take these words as applicable not to David only at the time he put the question, but as suitable also to the family of God who tread in the experience of David. The first question David asks his soul is, why are you cast down, O my soul? Let us look then at some of the things which cause the souls of God's people to be often cast down within them. But first, what is it to be cast down? It is to be depressed, to feel our soul bowed down within us, to be sunk low in a low spot, to be brought off from presumption, false confidence, levity, profanity, Pharisaism, and worldliness, and by the work of the Spirit upon us, to be brought into that low place out of which nothing but the hand of the Lord evidently stretched out and his arm made bare can deliver us. Now, there are many things that cause the souls of God's family to be cast down from time to time within them. First, the guilt of sin. If there be anything that casts the soul down more than another, that sinks it into a low spot before the throne of the Most High, it is the guilt of sin lying with weight and power upon the conscience. And when I speak of guilt, I do not confine it to the first convictions of sin produced by the law, in the application of the spirituality of the commandment to the conscience, but I mean the felt sense of sin as it pursues us all our journey through, as it perpetually rises up in our heart, polluting the conscience, and striving ever to regain the mastery. This it is that makes the guilt of sin lie with weight upon the soul. I do believe from soul experience that one of the greatest, if not the greatest burden and trial to the child of God is the daily, hourly, minutely, momently workings of sin, the adulterous eye, the roving heart, the defiled imagination, the constant stream of iniquity polluting every word and thought, every feeling and desire, is and must be a burden to the soul, just in proportion as the fear of God lives and works in a man's conscience. And whenever sin gets a mastery over us, though it be but for a short time. I'm not speaking here necessarily of gross sins, or of outward falls, for sin in some shape or other is perpetually striving to rule within where it does not rule without. Guilt will as surely follow it as the shadow does the sun. But even where sin does not get the mastery, those whose consciences are tender in God's fear continually feel the workings of pride, hypocrisy, presumption, and self-righteousness, of carnal desires, of filthy lusts, of worldly mindedness, and of everything that is hateful and vile in the eyes of a holy God. No, do we not continually find how, in spite of all our desires, and all the resolutions we make, which are not wise in making, to the contrary, how instantaneously temptation sets fire to the combustible materials we carry within, and what an awful flame there is at times bursting forth in our carnal mind. These things, I am sure, will bring guilt, shame, and sorrow upon every conscience that is quickened to fear God, and just in proportion to the depth and working of godly fear in a man's soul will be the burden of sin from time to time upon his conscience. Number 2. Another thing that casts down the souls of God's family is the unceasing conflict which they have to maintain between those desires to live under God's leading and those desires to live after the course of this world. In other words, the conflict between nature and grace, between the spirit and the flesh, will always cast down the soul in proportion to the intensity of the struggle. To be baffled as we are hourly baffled in all our attempts to do good. To find the carnality of our hearts perpetually obstructing every desire that rises in our bosom to be heavenly minded, spiritual, enjoy God's word, feel his presence, and live to his honor and glory. Thus to have the tide of carnality and pollution perpetually bearing down every spiritual desire in the heart. Must not that cast down the soul that covets nothing so much as to live under a sense of God's presence and favor? And that this conflict should be a perpetual and unceasing one, that we should have so little respite from it, that it should not be merely now and then, but more or less in proportion to the depth of godly fear, always be going on in our soul. Must not this cast down the poor soul that is the subject of it? I am sure it casts me down day after day, and sometimes hour after hour, to feel such an unceasing and perpetual conflict between that in us which is spiritual, heavenly, and holy, and that in us which is earthly, carnal, sensual, and devilish. Number 3. Another thing which casts down the soul is the hiding of God's countenance, the inability to realize his most gracious presence, or feel the manifestations of his most precious favor. How continually the souls of God's people are cast down by reason of their inward darkness. When the Lord is the light of their countenance, when he supports them by his gracious word and spirit, they are not cast down. But when they cry and he does not hear, when they pour out their hearts before him and get no answer, when in spite of all the tears that wet their cheeks and the convulsive sobs that heave from their bosom, there is no word, no testimony, no sweet inshining, no precious flowing out of his gracious presence and love, must not that make the soul of God's people to be cast down within them? Number 4. The temptations that the Lord's people are so painfully exercised with is another thing that makes their souls to be often cast down within them. There is in the bosom of the child of God a holy principle, as holy as God is holy, as pure as God is pure, for it is God's own nature. That is his communicable nature, as we read in 2 Peter 1:4, partakers of the divine nature. This pure nature must ever hate sin, must ever loathe that which is opposed to Christ's image, must always painfully feel the presence and power of everything that is opposed to its spirituality, holiness and purity. Now when a man is assailed with temptations to blasphemy, to curse and swear, to doubt the truth of the Scriptures, to question the very being of God, to disbelieve the Godhead of Jesus, to commit the worst of iniquities, and these temptations are perpetually struggling and striving for the mastery in his heart. Must not this cast his soul down? What life, what power, what tenderness, what reality can there be in a man's religion if he can feel the waves of temptation roll over his soul, and he as hard under them as a rock in the ocean? Is it not just in proportion to the depth of the work of grace upon a man's heart, in proportion to the spirituality and liveliness of the new man of grace, that temptations are painfully and sensibly felt? Filth is no burden to the filthy. It is the clean who feel the disgusting nature of filth. And so spiritually, sin to the dead sinner is no burden. Temptation to those who have but a name to live is no sorrow. But to the pure in heart, who shall see God, to the spiritually minded, to the partakers of the divine nature, to those in whose bosoms the Lord of life and glory is enthroned to them, just in proportion to the depth of the Spirit's work upon their heart, must temptation ever prove a burden. Must not then the people of God be perpetually alive more or less to the power of temptation? Where is temptation? It is in my bosom. Every lust and obscenity, every unclean bird of night, every base and black reptile. Do I not carry about in my bosom a cage of these hideous and ravenous creatures? And will these beasts of prey lie torpid and inert in my bosom? Will not my old corrupt nature work, and that powerfully desire, and that actively? Will it not rage, and that often abominably within? If I carry, as I do carry in my bosom, a constant fountain of temptation, and if I have also in me a new principle that is born of God and is conformed in its measure to the mind and image of Christ, must not I groan and grieve, being burdened by the temptations that are constantly springing out of my carnal mind? If I have any spiritual feeling, any tenderness of conscience, and divine life in my heart, any longing to bless and praise God, or any desire to fear Him, will not my soul groan under temptation just in proportion to the depth of the Spirit's work in my conscience? Number 5. The many afflictions that the Lord's people have to pass through is another cause of their souls being cast down. And the Lord means these things to cast them down. Afflictions and trials that never cast them down, call them afflictions, it is but the name. The Lord in sending afflictions means them to do a certain work. We are high, they are sent to bring us low. We are often standing upon a pinnacle of presumption and confidence, and the Lord sends these troubles to put us in our right spot. We are proud, they are meant to humble. We are worldly, they are meant to purge out of us this worldly spirit. We are carnal, they are sent to subdue this carnality. We are often straying from the Lord into bypaths. They are meant to bring us by wholesome corrections into the straight and narrow path that leads to glory. Afflictions thereof which are not felt, that never exercise a man and try his spirit, do not call them afflictions, they are not worth the name. To call them so is but hypocrisy and deceit. But if we endure hardness as good soldiers of Jesus Christ, if we are really among the afflicted people of God, we must expect at times to be cast down and burdened by troubles. Now the Lord sends afflictions for a special purpose, and this special purpose is to cast down the soul, that He Himself may have the honor of raising it up. Many of the Lord's people are deeply afflicted by bodily afflictions, and those who pass through bodily afflictions, I am a living witness to it, know how they depress the spirit and cast down the soul, and how they open the door for Satan to come in with many doubts and fears, and many distressing trials and exercises. But how good it is to be thus laid low and kept low. What a check it is to the spirit of levity, frivolity, worldliness, and folly that there is in our carnal mind. What heavy weights and burdens are needed to have this horrible and abominable levity and frivolity kept effectually down. Now a man cannot be very light and trifling who has a suffering body, and is continually depressed in the spirit by the bodily afflictions he passeth through, nor can there be much room for lightness and frivolity in a man's soul when his poor body is racked with disease and pain. The Lord therefore sends these bodily afflictions upon his people in order to mortify and subdue that wretched spirit of frivolity which is usually so active in them. Others of the Lord's family are cast down by heavy temporal afflictions. The Lord does not see fit that his people should have this world's honors, riches, and prosperity. They cannot stand it. Riches, honor, prosperity, an easy path do not suit the family of God. They puff up with pride, feed the spirit of worldliness, lead a man into bypass, and take him away from the company of God's poor exercised family. The Lord therefore for the most part exercises his family with temporal afflictions, with poverty, with distressing circumstances, and thus casts them down and keeps them down, that they may not be lifted up and so drawn away by temporal prosperity. Others of the Lord's family have to pass through heavy family afflictions and trials. A dear wife is taken off. A beloved husband is torn from a wife's bosom. A child is smitten down with the hand of disease, or else the children, instead of being comforts, grow up to be burdens and sorrows to their parents. By these afflictions the Lord often casts down the souls of his people. Others of the Lord's people are cast down by their evidences being beclouded, by many anxious doubts and fears as to the reality of the work of grace upon their souls, by seeing and feeling so little of the love of God shed abroad in their hearts, by having the depths of their unbelief and infidelity open up to their view, and being thus made to fear lest concerning faith they someday may make shipwreck. Many are the causes, each heart knows its own bitterness, why the souls of the Lord's people are cast down within them, and this is the case not only now and then, but more or less unceasingly. For they need continually to be put into a low place. They cannot bear much prosperity. They need to be well plagued in exercise, that they may prize divine consolation, and feel that nothing can support and bless them but the hand of God alone. B. But David puts another question to his soul, not differing much from the first, but still having a slight distinction. Why are you disturbed in me? The expression cast down refers more especially to present feeling, but the word disturbed refers more to the anxiety of the soul in looking to the future. The causes of trouble in the heart of a child of God are often of this twofold nature. Not merely does present sorrow and affliction cast down the soul at the time, but it is disturbed at the prospect of the future. This ever will be the tendency of affliction and sorrow. Could we see the rainbow in the cloud and feel assured the sun would soon shine forth, half the trouble would be taken away. But to see the whole atmosphere enwrapped in misty darkness, to view clouds rising upon all sides of the horizon, not to behold one ray of light piercing through the dark gloom, it is this which makes the soul not merely cast down for the present, but disturbed for the future. Thus, when under guilt there will be disquietude until pardon is sweetly experienced. When under afflictions there will be disquietude and doubts how the afflictions will terminate. When engaged in conflict with the enemies of our soul's peace, there will be disquietude lest we should be overcome in the battle. When the body is afflicted with pain and disease, disquietude may be felt whether it will end in death. When family afflictions press down the mind, there will be disquietude, what the result may be. In a word, whatever be the source of sorrow that casts down the soul, from the present trouble and present affliction, there will be almost necessarily many an anxious glance towards the future, many a watching whether the cloud gives any indication of dispersion, many fears lest a thunderstorm whose roar we hear in the horizon, and the flashes of which we perceive afar off, will not approach nearer and nearer, and burst wholly upon us, so that the soul is cast down, distressed, and burdened. It is not merely so with what is taking place at the present, but suspicious and disquietudes arise as to what will be the outcome, as to what we may expect, and as to what we may fear for the future. How gracious and merciful was it of the Lord to cause the soul of David thus to be exercised. How kind and tender it was of him to cause him by the pen of inspiration to record in the sacred scriptures his painful experience. We have reason to bless God for it. Many of the Lord's dear family have had to take this inquiry into their lips, and with a burdened heart cry aloud, "Why are you cast down, O my soul? And why are you disturbed in me?" But secondly, we will pass on to the encouragement that David proposes to his own soul. It was, as I hinted, the tender and affectionate partner of all his sorrows, and he desired it to be also the tender and affectionate partner of all his joys. Hope in God. He here addresses himself to his own soul, as though he would cheer it onward, as though he would hold forth to it some prospect of relief, as though he would lay the strong arm of consolation beneath it that it might not utterly sink, as though he would encourage it to look for better times, as though he would say, "My soul, cast not away all your confidence, hope in God." This will enable us to look a little at the foundation of the encouragement, strength, and relief that David proposed to his soul. Hope in God. What is the source? What is the fountain of hope, of all true and spiritual hope, such as David here encourages his soul to look to? Hope in God springs from various causes. We will endeavor to enumerate a few, but observe. There can only be hope in God just in proportion as we are brought into a state to need it. The Lord throws nothing away in providence, and the Lord will throw nothing away in grace. Those who have deeply scrutinized the works of God as Creator have admired the simplicity and perfection of His creative hand. Nothing is given that was not needed. Nothing is withheld that could not be spared. No scantiness on the one hand, nor waste or profusion on the other. So it is in the kingdom of grace as in the kingdom of nature. No good withheld from those who walk uprightly. No superfluous good wildly lavished upon those who do not need it. Thus we must be brought by the Spirit into a state and case to need these encouragements in order that we may have them. Consolations without afflictions, liftings up without castings down, communications out of Christ's fullness without previous emptyings, are but delusions. The one must be suitable and proportionate to the other. Preparation for God's bounty is indispensable. If that preparation do not take place, blessing suitable cannot come. Thus, one source of hope in God springs out of the invitations that the Lord has given in His Word to the poor and needy, to the exercised and distressed, to the burdened and sorrowful. For instance, the Lord says, "Come unto me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest." Matthew 11, verse 28. "Look unto me and be saved, all the ends of the earth. For I am God, and there is none else." Isaiah 45:22. "Him who comes unto me, I will never cast out." John 6, verse 37. These invitations, addressed in God's Word to certain characters, are applied from time to time by the Blessed Spirit, with due and power to the soul, so as to encourage it to hope in God. You will observe that the psalmist here encourages his soul to hope in God, not in God's mercy, not in God's faithfulness, though both these are needed, but if I may use the expression, he takes his desponding soul beyond the attributes of God to hope in the person of God himself. So that in order that there may be this hope in God, springing out of the suitability and preciousness of the invitation addressed to certain characters, there must be in the heart and conscience a personal knowledge of God, and this bringing out of its own manifestations to the soul, and a communication to the heart of that precious faith by which the invitations are received into the affections, as set forth in the Scriptures of truth. Now the effect of the suitability and preciousness of the invitations flowing into the heart and conscience is to raise up a hope in God. It may not be a hope that affords strong consolation. It may not be a hope that entirely overcomes despondency, but yet it shall be a hope that shall raise the soul up from the waves. It is something like a buoy at sea, or the lifeboat in a storm. It may often be dashed by the waves that beat upon it, yea, so dashed as to be hidden by the foam. But let there be a subsistence of the troubled waters. Let the waves and billows cease, then we see the buoy again. The sure mark of the anchor beneath is not lost, though it may be hidden for a short space from the view. Thus hope in God springs out of the suitability, sweetness, truth, and preciousness of the invitations as they flow with power into the conscience, supports the souls under the waves of doubt and despondency, although it may feel the foam off and dash over its poor desponding head, and even fear that it may prove a castaway. Secondly, but there is a hope in God springing out of the past testimonies that he has given to the soul. But again, hope in God will sometimes spring from a sight of scriptural evidence raised up by the Spirit of God in the heart. I draw a distinction between testimonies and evidences. All testimonies are evidences, but all evidences are not testimonies. The fear of God and a tender conscience, the sacrifice which a man has been enabled to make for God and truth, the hungerings and thirstings after Jesus, godly sorrow and contrition of soul, pantings, longings, and crying after the Lord, these are evidences, but still, though evidences, we cannot rely upon them as we can rely upon testimonies. They are not strong enough to bear the soul up. We can see and admire them in others and believe them to be, in their case, gracious marks of the Lord's teaching. But when we look into our own bosoms, we cannot see these evidences as distinctly in ourselves as we see them in others.